Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. For our first afternoon session, we have Steef Jan with us from the Netherlands. Welcome, Steef Jan.
Welcome.
How are you?
I'm good. Do you see that I'm a bit blurred or?
Yes, the camera has a little bit green color.
Okay, I will try. But you can hear me fine, right?
Yes, the sound is absolutely fine. Looks better now.
Hey, he's refocused. That's cool. Okay.
So for our audience, the small introduction, Steef Jan, you are a multi-year MVP, Microsoft MVP. You're a cloud architect, blogger. And as I saw today, you were also in the organization of the Azure Lowlands.
That's correct. So,
in January.
Yeah, so of course, with the years, I done speaking and I also was interested in how organizing events from the other side, like what you're doing currently. Organizing events instead of being in front of people. So that's an interesting thing too, to be able to create an event like what you're doing now in Belgrade for the audience. It's virtual this time, so Lowlands was virtual too. So that's a little bit of a difference.
As I looked a couple of the sessions, I might say that you did very well for the organization. It was a great conference.
Yeah, it was fun to do.
Great. I also noticed one interesting thing because I'm actually located in Amsterdam for the past year and a half, and I see that you moved to Wortell recently, the company.
To which company?
Wortell.
Yeah, there was a short breeze. I actually went to another company closer by because I found out that I just want to focus more on integration and less to modern workplace and such. So it seems that we weren't an actually good fit, but that's fine. It's I think that I'm best suited doing integration work in a hybrid scenario or in the cloud, and you will see that too in my presentation that will follow shortly. So
okay. So then, if you're ready, I'm gonna also share your presentation, so you may start. Let's see.
Okay, so that means Azure Saturday Belgrade, the first slide is visible?
Yes, it is. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Then I will start. So first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, sponsors as well. So I'll share the sponsors slide later on. But thank you guys in Belgrade organizing this great event. It's virtual and that's fine. Virtual is a little bit the new norm these days, and hopefully, when COVID will disappear, at least through vaccination and such, we will be able to be in person again. But we'll do it virtually today from Amsterdam, in my case, or at least in Ede. I'm Steef Jan Wiggers. So in this Azure Saturday Belgrade, I will talk about a session, or at least I will do a session about communicating systems, at least system communication using Azure Integrated Services. So that's kind of my session today. The story outline will be a bit, I'll talk about integration, I'll talk about architecture, technology, some, real world cases, best practices, where does potentially Power Automate fit in. It has some integration aspect as well. We'll also look a bit at the market in general, what analysts will say, and some takeaways. So generally, this is the outline of my story. So what I kind of want to begin with is the Tower of Babel. So you kind of think, okay, what's this going to do with system integration? Well, kind of the fact, if you look at the biblical story, it's about people that were like, there's one people, traveling around the globe, and they kind of settled down in the city, and they kind of built this tower because they wanted to reach heaven. And they were all speaking the same type of language. But in the end of the day, God wasn't so satisfied. So he disrupted the fact that, everyone was speaking different languages. So they couldn't understand each other anymore, and kind of, were not able to finish, building that tower. And this is a painting from the Dutch Fleming artist called Peter Bruegel. So the elder, and it's called the Tower of Babel. So that's what you see here. But you're using that metaphor, right? So you still have that tower, but instead of people, it's systems. And all these systems don't really talk to each other either, as in, each has their own kind of entity model or data model. And for these applications that could support your business process, they have to talk to each other too. But with the energy of people, they don't speak always the same kind of language. These systems in the cloud can either be for finance, HR, planning, field services. If you look at Dynamics, storage, there's all kinds of services, which you just saw in the previous, where are all kind of SaaS applications that support your business process. Instead of being on-prem, they're now kind of in the cloud because of the the rise of the cloud. And Salesforce, one of the first, I think, or some of the others that are now all available as SaaS solutions. So this means that there's a change if you look at the application landscape. So like yesterday, a decade ago even, all these systems like SAP and Oracle and Siebel CRM and even Dynamics, they're all on-prem. They're all communicated with or exchange data as well to support business processes. This kind of changed with the coming of the cloud. So still some systems were on-prem. There were also systems that were available in the cloud, which means that there was this hybrid type of communication necessary. And if we go look further down the road, eventually maybe everything, all those systems are kind of in the cloud. So then looking at what Microsoft done. So this is, we're talking about Azure. So let's look a bit about the journey. So in the beginning, of course, to have systems communicate with each other, they kind of had BizTalk Server. So it's kind of this broker product, kind of deemed as the best of breed as well, exchanging data between systems, kind of using this hub-spoke model where, Azure, where BizTalk Server is kind of the hub and it's talking to all these applications. And all those messages, go through this message type broker to each other. So this was a way to have on-premise systems communicate with each other. Then, of course, with the announcement of Microsoft Azure in 2008 during the PDC, things changed a bit because this type of technology of system communication, messaging, and all that stuff kind of need something in the cloud as well. So the first iteration or attempt was what's called Service Bus AIE and EDI Labs. Was a CTP in December, a year or so after Azure became GA. Wasn't so successful, but that was the first attempt. The second attempt was still had this acronym of BizTalk in it, was BizTalk Services, which kind of was this integration platform service capability that was available to allow this system communication. But yet this second iteration also didn't work out that well. So then the third iteration kind of came with Logic Apps, which became GA in 2016. So with this journey, you kind of have a solution similar to BizTalk Server, but then you have it in the cloud with connectors and such. And I will talk about that in a bit, allowing this, formulating kind of business processes, connecting all these systems together and allowing system communication. So if I bring back the, application landscape and then look from integration, like the technology, I already talked about, BizTalk Server in the earlier days, allowing the communication of systems. Going forward, Logic App came, API management, part of Azure Integration Services, which I'll talk about later, kind of, already bridging the gap between the on-prem world and the cloud world. And also BizTalk evolved a bit, creating what's called adapters, and allowing the communication as well. First with the service bus, supporting relay, service bus technology, and later on also the ability to communicate with Logic Apps. And then Logic App kind of became the, I would say, facade or broker towards the cloud world. And then if you look at cloud entirely, then you have a certain set of technologies enabling you to do system communication when they're all SaaS system and everything is in the cloud. And those services bundled together are, the API management, Event Grid, Logic App, Service Bus are kind of, the suite of Microsoft capabilities or services, I would say, that allow you to integrate the system and allow the communication between each other. So what I like to do now is look a bit at the integration tech. So I've mentioned those four services, or at least you saw those four services. Those are kind of the Azure Integration Services. So they're bundled together. They're just, individual services you can provision. So you have your API management as kind of, ways to manage your APIs, bringing a front door facade of Azure services available to outside parties, if you like. You got Logic Apps building, your processes and connectivity, similar to what you could find in BizTalk Server orchestration kind of thing. So you're kind of creating your business flow, I would say. You get your service bus for messaging, and even you got one of the later editions of Event Grid supporting even event-driven type of solutions, which I will talk about as well. So let's look at one of the first. This is Logic Apps. So this is one of the services available since 2016. You can connect on-prem services through the on-premise data gateway, which under the hood uses a relay, a capability inside the service bus. Your API management, which also has a self-hosting capability as well, exposing some of your maybe on-prem services running towards other applications. You got the Logic App itself for its connector to connect to Salesforce or other Azure services and so on. You can build all kinds of solutions, even smart solutions where you leverage cognitive services through connectors inside a Logic App. So it can support all kinds of process. And what kind of characteristic about a Logic App is that it provides connectors. So those connectors are created by Microsoft. There's a dedicated product group that created out of 100 out-of-the-box connectors, SaaS, on-prem, and so forth, kind of giving you that experience of fastly creating a solution to connect different systems together, if you like, with using Logic Apps. There's even a capability where you can use your custom connectors, which means that you can wrap an API yourself and then kind of create a connector, because all these connectors are kind of wrappers around APIs. And lastly, you can also, through the API management, consume APIs inside your Logic App as well, if you like to. So those are kind of the capabilities. So it's all about workflow with a trigger and actions. Those triggers are, through connectors, and then followed by multiple actions. And then these actions can also include connecting to other systems. And the way the Logic App works, I think this is interesting too. If you look at the component architecture, it's kind of, you have this workflow definition, trigger followed by multiple actions. And basically creating your workflow definition, which ends up in the Logic App resource provider. That's one thing. It kind of, reads that workflow definition, which is kind of a JSON DSL, breaks it down, distributes it to a Logic App runtime, which executes it subsequently. And with the connectors, you have this connection manager and connector runtime. Those are important as well. If you see it manages the connection, the configuration, the credentials, security, and the connector runtime is basically the abstraction of those connectors, which are basically open API descriptions or that kind of stuff. So this is kind of representation of a Logic App. So you see there's a trigger followed by an action and followed by another action. So for each, we'll loop through a message. It will pick from the queue and subsequently insert it into SQL, and then it will complete the message. So once you do this, you save, you kind of have your workflow definition. The workflow definition is triggered when there's a message entering the service bus. So that's kind of your trigger task, which means it will subsequently execute different types of tasks. So there's this subsequent task that, kind of looks at this DSL is like, okay, I have to follow these steps, which is, a for each. It will break down in multiple other tasks, doing the insertions in parallel if you want, and subsequently you'll complete the message, and then you're kind of done. Workflow complete. So this is kind of what under the hood happens with this workflow. And it's all based on tasks, so no threat management whatsoever. There's at least one guaranteed execution, some retries regarding transition failures. If one of those, those distributed tasks are on different pieces of hardware in a data center, so if one doesn't work, the workflow orchestrator will send it to another machine and say, hey, you have to execute this. And this all looks a little bit under the hood, or if you look at this kind of runtime, you could say, hey, it's kind of similar, maybe if you know BizTalk Server from that perspective with, your adapters and kind of your messaging engine and your orchestrator. Now you can have either this Logic App as consumption. So, you provision it inside a data center, and then, any other company can do the same thing in a data center. So you kind of share the kind of same set of hardware somewhere in a data center, but you can also isolate this, similar to the app service runtime, which you can isolate too. So like, hey, I want to have my own runtime and execute it. So you reserve a set of data center capacity, giving you the Logic App runtime and connector runtime all to yourself. So that part of the compute is yours. And then, it has maybe better scalability, performance, or whatsoever, some better connectivity through express routes, VNet support, and so forth. Plus, you have this one-off costs of so many transactions, etc. So that's another way of looking at it. Going forward, and this is kind of what now was announced during Ignite 2020, it's Logic App Preview, which kind of gives you the ability to run Logic Apps inside the app service runtime. And this is a change, meaning that you can either have your shared runtime, which is just out of the box, you're using Logic Apps. You can either have this dedicated ICE runtime, or with the Logic App currently in preview, which you could view as the 4th iteration of this iPaaS capability in Azure, gives you the self-hosting ability as well. So you can either run these Logic Apps in the runtime and the app service runtime as transactional, so that means preserving state, or you can run them stateless, giving you a little bit more performance and throughput. And you can even containerize your Logic App because it runs on the app service runtime. So it gives you a lot of ability to run Logic Apps kind of anywhere, if you like. And that's why I put this blog post in one of my former companies. So Tom Kirkhover really wrote an interesting blog post saying, hey, now it gives you the ability to run Logic Apps anywhere you want. This is all about, I think, important characteristics about Logic App itself. Going forward to another part of the Azure Integration Services is the Service Bus. So this is one of the oldest capabilities inside Azure Service, inside the Azure platform, since I would say the beginning. Fully managed offering, reliable, secure, giving you the ability to do communication with other parties as well in a more platform agnostic way. It has some compliance with AMQP and some other protocols, gives you entities like queues, topics, a relay, first in, first out, decoupling, transactional behavior. So there's all kind of the ability that the Service Bus offers. And the main part, I would say, and I think this is kind of an interesting animation, one of the first things, or the things that it offers, is this bidirectional communication through the Service Bus relay, which is also the technology underneath the on-premise data gateway. Some service you can get to set up this connectivity between Logic Apps and on-prem, or maybe you also know this capability through Power BI, because it's also a service you can get through that area, run it on-prem, which is installation of a service a service which basically supports this relay protocol, which is a part of Service Bus basically. So it's all about these unbound connections. The other thing it offers is queuing. So you might know message queuing, RabbitMQ, all that kind of stuff, which you can find on-prem. This is the Azure Service Bus capability you find in Azure. It gives you can have one or multiple systems sending out messages to one queue when there's only one who can take off the message. Basically, it's kind of one-on-one communication, but you can have multiple senders or producers of messages and one consumer. If you want to have multiple consumers, then this is where the topic basically comes in. So you have one topic with multiple subscriptions to it based on filtering. So that's kind of the important aspects of the Service Bus. So we got the Logic App, we got the Service Bus, and then when looking at messaging, the other part that's being added, or one of the component of service, is the Azure Event Grid. So it's kind of a backplane that sits in Azure, supported through Service Fabric. So it's kind of really serverless. It can scale really well, giving you the ability to send events centrally managed then to other event handlers. So it kind of allows you to do this event-driven architecture type of implementation or reactive programming. That's kind of what this offers. So with Queue, you have pushing messages and then consuming messages by pull. This is more about pushing messages, pushing them also to the consumers. So this is more a push-push model, both on pops-up paradigms, basically. So the Azure Event Grid, has multiple sources. These can be the Azure services that support Event Grid. Not all Azure services support Event Grid. For instance, looking at Cosmos DB, they have this change feed capability, which is kind of similar, but not the same. And subsequently doesn't support Event Grid because they already have the capability. The other thing is you can send events adhering to a proprietary Event Grid schema. I will mention that. I will talk about that in a second, but also custom events, cloud events, which is a cloud native compute initiative. All sending it centrally to what's called an Event Grid topic, and then you have multiple handlers behind. It could be functions, Logic App, could be buffering capability of Event Hub, storage, queues, could be also other applications that can either subscribe to it through, for instance, also a webhook mechanism. Basically, what it boils down to is that with Event Grid, it's all centrally managed of events. And then subsequently, adding subscribers to it, and also filtering on either event type, on suffix or prefix, and also ways of subscribing to either using webhook or other means. So the concepts are pretty straightforward. Event is where it happens. So within a service, custom application, and so forth. The event publishers are, the event sources, and publish those events to topics where publish and events basically are pushed towards, or at least the publisher send those events to those topics, and there are subscribers to these events. So publishers and subscribers come all together, and then you get your handlers dealing with it. And those events, and this is kind of important, either adhere to a proprietary schema, which you find on the left-hand side, and there's also a cloud event schema, which is the CNCF initiative. It's a little bit different, but it's kind of have these characteristics like ID, date, time, and such. Both have these data element, or property, I would say, in the JSON, which contains the specific about the source itself. So this is all about, some of the important characteristics, something you need to know about Event Grid. And then finally, you have within that suite of Azure Integration Services, you've got API management, which is kind of this API tool, managed service capability, allowing you to expose APIs as proxies to the outside world, and then do monitoring, securing, maybe do some transformation. And it could also be this API gateway of Logic App APIs and functions and so forth. So briefly looking in this technology, it's kind of the hub of enterprise applications. So you got your API managers or developers on one end, abstracting, kind of publish those services inside this intermediate capability, which is the API management of services that are either hosted in a VM, on-prem, app service, could be a Logic App function, etc. And then on the other end, you have your developers that can either through the portal try out these APIs or incorporate them into applications. So it's a facade type of front door capability between what sits in your backend versus what you expose to the outside world. And you can also, there's a certain address on one end, but you can provide this custom domain or DNS on the front side if you like. And then you have this front door towards your applications. Some of those quality of service aspect you can distribute or push towards your gateway. And this gateway has APIs, and the APIs have operations, and these operations can be tied into multiple functions, logic apps, etc. So you can bind a set of APIs or a set of small services and expose them through one API with multiple operations, apply policies, securing, monitoring. You can secure those backends as well, and etc. What's important here to note is these policies that allow when a message is sent in, you have inbound processing, some processing in the backend if you like, and also the outbound processing and on error. Those are kind of the capabilities where you can place all kinds of policies. So you don't have to really code that much. You can set rate limiting. You can enforce that you want to validate a token. You can do retries. You can do all kinds of stuff inside API management. This is kind of a picture, a screenshot depicting the fact that this is where you kind of shape your APIs, where you can place your policies on the backend, outbound processing. And if you look at the code behind, you also find the on error part, which is important when one of those policies fail. And then you can also apply policies there. Scoping of these policies. So globally is the global instance of your API management. You got your product, which is a logic kind of container for your APIs and operations. So this means that you can either have these global policies accounting for all the products where the APIs are in operations. You can have rate and quota limiting within a product as a policy applied to APIs and operations. You can apply this Java token validation type of thing on top of the APIs and API policy for each of the operations that are being called. And then you can do some caching, URL, and body type of policies when you want to do some transformation, or you want to filter away some of the headers when you provide a response back, etc. So let's say this is kind of when you call an API inside your API management. So you have to provide a key which is enforced if you do APIs in a product, which is kind of an API key. Then foo is your API and bar is your operation. Okay, so far so good. So I talked a little bit about your system communication, the story going forward where you have this cloud tag, which is the Azure Integration Service, enabling you to create solutions to enforce or allow system communication. But what's kind of the solution architecture or rationale behind it? If you look at the bigger picture, if you zoom out, okay, you got your tech, you got your systems, but how do I build up the solution? Because there's more to it than just some of the integration services I mean. If you look more from an architectural perspective, then there's other stuff you have to deal with as well. Non-functionals, security, availability, and all such. So you got your infrastructure, you get some security aspects, you got your monitoring operations, you got your DevOps or application lifecycle management, and then you get some of the layers and building up your integration solution. So it's APIs, integration, and messaging. So looking at it, there are certain responsibilities, and these are distributed, as you can see in this picture, with regards to looking more from a distance toward your complete solution architecture for your integrations. So you got tracing, monitoring, you got your source control, of course, DevOps pipeline, security with regards to accessing secure keys and such, which basically you can leverage Key Vault for, the messaging, your integration APIs, and your infrastructure depending on availability, networking, and such. So this means if you plot all those technologies of Azure, you find some of which I talked about, which form the Azure Integration Services, but there's more services towards it. If you look at how you have to build up your integration solution to have the system communication between all kinds of systems. Okay, so tech, architecture, okay, show me some real stuff. Show me some real world integration scenarios. How does this work? Okay. So I've done I've worked at 40 plus companies doing integration since 2010, from Salesforce integration with BizTalk, all the way up to today. So it's quite a bit. And this is one of the cases where there's still BizTalk involved with connectivity on-prem with warehouse management system, but some of the operational data and finance data had to be pushed towards Dynamics 365. So this was already a company on a cloud journey saying, okay, the first thing we're going to do, we were going to move our on-prem ERP towards the cloud. So we're going to leverage Dynamics 365's finance operations. In those days, it's now called Finance Supply Chain Management. So it's renamed, it's still the same app underneath. So this solution is, on one end, we're securing our API endpoint, which is HTTP endpoint, through an HTTP provisioned logic app. So it has an HTTP trigger, so it gets an endpoint. That endpoint is being secured by API management. API management has an IP address, so you can say to the logic app, hey, I only want to allow traffic from this IP address. So you can also do a little bit of whitelisting already. Or other means it would be using ICE and then VNet integration. That's a different story, but you can secure that endpoint using API management. So that happens. So BizTalk pushes some of the data towards that logic app, which subsequently will push that data towards Dynamics. Also, again, through an API management facade as well. Applying inside what I talked about, a policy to do some mapping. So you can do mapping in BizTalk because it has mapping capability, but you can also do some XSLT mapping inside a policy, or you can even do liquid mapping, which means that you can map JSON to JSON or JSON to text and so forth. So this is kind of the setup. And leveraging, in this case, logic app and API management. Subsequently, you can also have a complete cloud native type of integration. So this is another scenario where I had to integrate Salesforce with ServiceNow. So an entity changed inside Salesforce, leading to push an event towards a logic app, which sits between Salesforce and an event. And why? It does some translation because it wasn't able to send out a proprietary schema for event grid. So the logic app sits there as an endpoint secure for APIM to push, or at least do some mapping and push the event towards an event grid, which subsequently has a handler, which looks, hey, okay, something changed. I will have that ID, and for that, using that ID, I will call Salesforce. And calling Salesforce, though, however, those APIs are secure for OAuth. So I kind of have to first, through a policy, get the token before I can call an operation, getting some of the data. And then Some of the data is being translated for a liquid template, as you can see here, getting back into the logic app, which means it's kind of, this uniform format, which we call a canonical data model inside that logic app, then being pushed out through another API that communicates with ServiceNow sitting inside API management, doing another translation, doing an insert in ServiceNow. So this is a complete cloud native integration using logic apps, API management, and Event Grid in this case. And the magic, if we revert back to that story about language and stuff and the Tower of Babel, and even those systems having different entities, maybe different formats, they have to talk to each other too. And the magic is the transformation. The system communication in the end of the day is that you host some kind of solution, but it always involves transformation, because one entity is always differently structured than a similar entity in another program. It's always differently structured, named, etc. So you always need some type of translation. So this can either be facilitated through an integration account, which is a capability in Azure as well, as a placeholder or a container for your schemas and maps. You can either use an API function to do your transformation, or you can try to do this through an API management policy. So it's kind of the strategy you might have. Where do I apply the mapping? And the formats that you kind of can deal with is either XML or maybe even text. Somehow you might have to do XSLT. It could be that you do JSON mapping using Liquid, which is an open source capability from Shopify, or you can even use custom.NET if you like. The other thing I want to stress out with building those integration solutions, and I also showed you with the solution architecture that there are some best practices involved as well. Some of the things you don't want tight coupling between systems. So you have to provide some type of loosely coupling, either through this Event Grid capability with PubSub or using messaging. Monitoring is important to get into not only just the technical monitoring, maybe Azure alerting and stuff, but maybe also functional monitoring. If possible, if you need to have your system consistent in data distribution, you might have to look at event-driven, supplied through Event Grid. The other thing these days is it's more operational cost in terms of capital expenditure. Bistock, you had licensings and servers and such. Now it's all about consumption, so you have to look at some of those components as well with regards to cost management. Versioning is another important thing with APIs, and even with Logic App, you have to support multiple flows, or one flow is, in the end being decommissioned, so versioning is important. Your governance, so because you're dealing with data, it could be financial data and such, and who can access what service and so forth. And the other thing, of course, is important that you keep your environments consistent. So you have a development, test, acceptance, and production environment, and you have to need those consistent with regards to the infrastructure, but also the components that you land and subsequently propagate towards your production. So that's important too. So coming back to those solutions, so let's look at that cloud native solution again. So I painted the picture again, but then also put some of the facets in here, or things that I would like to stress out with regards to those best practices and stuff you need to think about. So you got to, of course, when you're dealing with systems, each kind of a system could have its own admin, right? Providing some access or endpoint, some capability allowing you to connect to those systems and get data out or get data in. And then looking at what you're building in the middle of those systems, so you can even call this, your data highway or whatever you want to call this, information going left and right. You have to look at your components. So you have to look at monitoring with alerts and metrics, cost management through budget and alerts, Azure Active Directory with regards to securing your APIs or providing communication with other systems, supporting those things like OAuth, key vault for secret management. With Event Grid, when there's dead lettering, you want the dead lettering capability, you need a storage account. With API management, you can think about subscription keys, API definitions and policies and such. From a more perspective, you also have maybe an Azure admin that may want to look at log analytics or other logs, monitoring capability within the Azure portal. And then from a developer perspective, that creates some of the infrastructure necessary for the integration solution. You can look at infrastructure templates, ARM templates, but API definition, or even the workload definitions that you want to, through Azure portal, through pipelines, provision to your environments to keep them consistent. And the other thing I want to stress out, or other aspects, are monitoring also in hybrid scenarios, where you can have this notion of centralized monitoring, which I'm showing you here for those green arrows, consolidate all the logging in one place, maybe also to provide more functional logging. And this is in that hybrid case scenario I talked about earlier as well. So you have your BizTalk admin, your finance person on the Dynamics side, and there's also Azure management in the middle, because again, you've got this highway of, or at least you get this data going from A to B. And you need to monitor this as well. So you centralize the monitoring. We've done it in this case towards, we're using the Azure Cosmos DB. We logged all those steps. We indexed those with search, and we kind of put a dashboard on top of giving those search capabilities and such. Other aspects in this hybrid scenario, again, cost management, monitoring. You got your RBAC policies and APIs and subscriptions with API management. From a developer perspective, again, templates for infrastructure, API definitions, Logic App workflow definitions, all that stuff through Azure pipelines towards your environments. And then even with the BizTalk case, you have this BizTalk deployment framework also give you the ability to automate deployments of your BizTalk artifacts. So again, completely automated. Okay, so those are kind of technologies you have in the Azure platform available. But there's another one. There's Power Automate. You might think, okay, Microsoft Cloud, where does Microsoft Cloud Power in? It's Power Automate. What are you talking about capability inside the Power Platform? Well, the reason I'm stressing this out is because of a capability called robotic process automation. It's kind of the screen caping type of technology. So maybe if you have all the systems on-prem or some of the systems that are not that open or don't have an API, you could, for instance, record some of the steps to get data out of those systems using what's called robotic process automation, which is a capability that sits inside Power Automate. So you can record those tasks, automate those tasks, and play them back. So this kind of Selenium type of technology used in the background. So there's a UI flows connector available in Power Automate, so you can use that, launch that recorder, record your click steps, and then kind of build up your flow. So what I have here is an automated demo. So let me just, so you see here, this is a closed application, which kind of provides a screenscaping capability. It's something that's being opened. So this is recorded, and then all those values are basically put into an Excel sheet. So this is kind of what's being recorded. You can see the YouTube here. So this is from a friend of mine called Ken Weir, who's a principal program manager for the Power Platform, in this case for Power Automate, very specialized in RPA, has many videos out. This interesting tag when some of your systems are not open enough to get data out of those systems and push them to somewhere else. So it's another alternative way of system communication. And if you look at all these technologies combined together, you see functions, you see Logic Apps, part of the Azure Integration Services, you see Power Automate. The reason I'm showing you this is also Azure's functions has to bring something to the table when it comes to maybe mapping or some of the other services or capabilities you want to program out yourself to support either Microsoft Power Automate or Azure Logic Apps. So you can create those Azure functions, expose those in those type of technology and leverage those. So these are all combined together. So with Power Automate capability in the Microsoft Cloud and Azure Integration Services, you have a myriad of technologies to allow system communication and build solutions around it to facilitate, your automated business process of all these systems. Okay, so what do the market analysts say? And the reason I'm pointing this out is because I also want to stress out how serious is this tech, because okay, it's got no coding and stuff involved, a lot about configuration and such, but still, it's serious tech. Logic Apps already being GA'd for 5 years now, and if you look at one of the main analysts, Gartner, has kind of put Microsoft together with some of the other technologies as in the leader quadrant. Like, hey, your vision and your completeness or the ability to execute with technology is very high. Even with Microsoft Logic Apps being the 4th iteration and such, it really competes with some of the other technologies. The plus, I think, with Microsoft is and their integration technology is that it sits beside Azure, so you can leverage even more services. The same accounts for another component inside the Azure Integration Services suite, I would say, and this is that last year also Azure API Management entered the leader quadrant. So it now can also, or at least does, provide some serious competition to other API management. So like Apigee, which is a front runner, that's technology or API management technology that's out there for 10 years, has been acquired by Google along the way. So that's why it says, Google API. of Apigee, and I think recently it had Apigee X, which was the latest release because of its 10th anniversary. So you see X-Way, you see Kong, which is an open source API management, but Microsoft's up there too. So that's good to know. And then even if you look at the Power Platform or low code, also there you find Microsoft in the leader quadrant, competing with OutSystem, Mendix, and such. ServiceNow also providing this capability like Power Automate. So all in all, you get some serious technology for integrating systems, whether those are on-prem or in the cloud. The key takeaways I kind of want to give you when you look to, if you have systems that need to communicate because they support some kind of process, either it's finance or ordering or HR, and you're using these cloud systems, or maybe you've got this hybrid setup, you need to look at some of the technologies. And I explained some of the technologies inside the Azure Integration Services, or you can even look at Power Automate, for instance. Or even, if you like, there's also workflow type of capability inside durable functions. Something you can look at as well. Just the key takeaway, or the important fact here, is all these technologies, even Event Grid and Service Bus, although both supporting pops up, are not competing technologies. Not at all. They are complementary in certain ways. That's why I also showed Power Automate, Logic App, and Functions. They can all complement each other. The important thing, though, in the end, when you're looking at system integration and supporting business process over multiple systems, is that you have to understand the technology, your processes, but also the non-functionals. That's why I also showed you from the real-world cases that you have to look at monitoring some of your infrastructure, security, and so forth. And one of the good things you can find with Microsoft now is that recently they also published the Azure Architect framework, giving you some things you can rely on as well with regards to best practice and such. You can even look at that framework, for instance, when it comes to the integration solution as well. Okay, so of course this slide deck will be shared, no worries. And there's some sources to explore. So there's integration services, service notes are. This is a website sponsored through, or at least hosted by Kovi, which is the vendor of serverless monitoring tech, coded block, Power Automate, so patterns, integration user groups. So that's Microsoft Learn even when it comes to the Architect framework, even all these individual capabilities I mentioned, Logic Apps, API management, Event Grid, and Service Bus. You can find all those resources there. And then finally, I'd like to thank you for attending me. So these are some of my stuff you can use to reach out to me, either LinkedIn. You can follow me on Twitter, so @Steef Jan. You can find me there. There's an email address. If you get the slides, you can also find my MVP program if you were interested, or my interview articles and stuff. And subsequently, I want to really thank the sponsors for, in this case, this event. So it's Azure Serbia, so it's super admins, it's mainstream unlocking technology, Microsoft, the development center of Serbia, all those guys. You always need sponsors to make this event happen. I can know because I did Azure Lowlands together with Eldert Godeboer. You need sponsors to make that happen. One way or the other, they're very important to us. So again, thank you. Also thank you for attending or listening now live, or maybe later on in the recording. Thanks for attending as well. And this brings me to the last slide, which is Q&A. And I think looking at the time, we have time.
We have time, and we actually have multiple questions from one of our friends. So the first one is, are you using outbound message for Salesforce integrations?
That's interesting. Yeah. So in 2010, when I did my first integration with Salesforce, it was actually about this outbound capability they have. So internally in Salesforce, they had this queue, which subsequently through code you get your message from, and then I could push it towards BizTalk in this case. Nowadays, though, with Logic App, the connector all abstracts this away. So you kind of either connect to, you connect basically to your Salesforce, and then you get data out of the entities, or maybe you push data into the entities, or you would communicate with Salesforce through its APIs.
The next question is, can I use just Azure Service as my API gateway instead of APIM, since APIM is quite expensive for us?
You mean the proxy capability you find in Azure Functions? Is that what you...
Well, I would need to ask Alexander to elaborate on that question, if possible. If not, we can go with the next one in the meantime.
Well, I know that Azure Functions, for instance, has this proxy capability, but it's kind of a lightweight capability of providing, let's say, a facade towards the outside world, which of course is less expensive than API management, which is more versatile with its capabilities and features.
Next question he has is, does it make sense to use service bus instead of event grid in your example for communication between LAs?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing because it's either through reliable messaging versus the timely matter. So if you want to keep your systems in sync near real time, then a push mechanism through pops up, of course, leads to lower latencies than using a queue in the middle, where you push a message and then you have to poll. So you have to either choose a certain polling interval, which means in your Logic app, if there's multiple messages, every poll also leads to consumption, right? So if you're talking about large loads, timely matter, latency, then you might wonder if a queue is your good choice from a consumption-based model, I would say. And if you want things in a timely manner, so push, and this is why, an entity in Salesforce needs to be updated in ServiceNow pretty fast. And a way to facilitate this is using Event Grid. So,
he's saying that he's just trying to find an alternative for API for the integrations that he's creating. So
you can always, of course, create create your facade yourself in an app service, extracting that endpoint of Logic app and then expose it. And then, of course, have your own quality of server capabilities with security and such. And then hosting it in an app service, of course, it's more customization. And then, of course, then your total cost of ownership will be different.
So people are very interested in the architectural designs that you presented, and they are asking if they can see them somewhere. Do you have a personal blog? Or
yeah, those drawings, you of course find them in these slide decks, and also through serverless notes. You find some of those patterns and architecture design as well. And there's another one. If you look at the Azure Architect Center, you can find also some drawings and stuff as well, and best practices and such. And if not, if they need those pictures, they can also shoot me an email, and then I'll just send those videos to them. No worries. There's no big secret.
Yeah. Okay. We will definitely share with all our users.
Yes.
The decks and everything else. Okay. Once again, thank you very much. It was
thank you
very
too.
useful and great presentation.
Thank you.
I hope you have enough free time to enjoy the sunny day in the Netherlands.
Yes, I did some. I walk my dogs in the morning, and I'll probably walk them again. You're right. In the Netherlands currently, it's beautiful weather. It was -5 or 6 last week, so there's been a spike, or at least a raise of more than 20 Celsius. So it's amazing. It's going from mid-severe winter to spring.
Absolutely true, and we enjoy it now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon, and hope to see you once again.
See you soon. Okay, thank you. Bye.